Okay, can we kick the proceedings off again, please? So just imagine I had arrived at 2:20. I would have said the words, welcome, welcome, welcome to our second psych debate. And it really is a great pleasure to see so many of you here today. And I'm really grateful for the excellent presentations we've had thus far. So one thing I want to say before I kind of continue with my own talk is we really want you to engage. So please do use Slido, as I said before the break, and also please tweet and use the correct hashtag, which is PsychDebate2. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about another side of the debate, which is the idea of a much more positive, upbeat side. So when we introduced this, the first debate in 2016, one of the ideas was to have a much more upbeat and collaborative event, one where we could try and discuss the issues in an engaging and friendly manner. Because at that stage, things were still very new. And one of the kind of main reasons we did that was because a group known as the Joint Committee for Psychology in Higher Education met in a hotel in London, and we discussed this very issue. So I think it's important to acknowledge that this event is presented to you under the auspice of the Joint Committee, which involves the British Psychological Society, the Experimental Psychology Society, and the Association of Heads of Psychology Departments in the United Kingdom. So, with that now clear, and I get some water, I want to now start the second half of today's proceedings. So I'm going to talk to you about the idea that psychological science is a trailblazer for science more generally, or at least we're going to pose the question and try and draw a conclusion at the end. This is a reminder of the Slido link and the code if you haven't been using it already. But I suppose the useful place to start or to continue our discussion is to go right back to 2015 and consider Brian Nosak's original paper. And as we will all know in this room, because you will all, I suspect, have read this paper, but in this key paper, I argue this was the beginning of the change. And this led to us using the terminology replication crisis. And the idea that when we tried to replicate 100 studies, only 36% of these replications were successful, and of those, the effect sizes was often much smaller than in the original study. So we used this term crisis. And as a result, lots of things have happened since. So since 2015, many different events, many different key changes have happened. And I think overall they're very positive, and they're very positive not just for psychology, but for science. So what I wanted to do is convince you of that, and then also consider some of the less positive aspects. So as I said, 2 years ago, we had a wonderful event here. We had the replication and reproducibility debate number 1. This is what it looked like. Lots of people smiling. I'll get you to take a photograph later when you're all upbeat and incredibly excited. And we had a great panel of individuals who were very much involved in replication. So that, to me, was an excellent start from the UK's point of view. But in addition, lots of incredible things have happened. We have the Centre for Open Science. It's a direct result of the excellent work that Brian Nosak and his colleagues have been doing. And as we know, the central aim of this is to show your work, share your work, advance science. That's open science. And that's what we're all striving towards. We now have the Open Science Framework, an incredible resource for researchers, not just in psychology. If you go and look at the mission statement of the framework and of the Open Science group generally, it's about every part of science. It isn't just psychology. Look at the other things that have changed. Really brilliant innovations. Directly as a result of the replication crisis, we now have the Association of Psychological Science really embracing replication. We've registered replication reports. The very recent one by Martin Hager and colleagues on ego depletion, again, is a good example where we've tried to take a balanced look at existing effects and try and identify if they're real or not. But we've engaged in that in a very upbeat and collaborative fashion. Many journals now offer registered reports. Chris Chambers, as you know, at Cardiff University has been a real pioneer in this area. He's done excellent work, particularly with his own journal that he's an associate editor at. Cortex is one of the first, and Chris has been pushing many other journals to do that too. Chris Graff would have also mentioned earlier, the British Psychological Society, we have recently launched our first registered report for the Journal of Neuropsychology. And the whole idea is that this is just learning the ropes with the leadership of Martin Edwards of that journal, but the plan will be to try and roll that out to all the 11 journals in time. But we felt it's better to try and embrace any additional problems we might have, iron them out, and then try and extrapolate it across all of our journals. So these are excellent innovations, I would argue. We are then talking about things like this. We talk about frequentists versus Bayesians. There was a time when we didn't do such things. There is a new statistics out there. There's a new learning, and our younger, early career researchers are very much embracing these methods. But the whole idea of putting the slide up here is that we've embraced these new approaches. Although interestingly, the Bayesians will argue with the frequentists, and we often still can't necessarily come to an agreed viewpoint. But the key issue is there is a new statistics out there which is going to make our science better, and that is driven ultimately by psychological scientists. The funding landscape has also changed. In Germany in particular, the German research councils have been incredibly influential in changing how replication and transparency of research is included in how they fund their research. If you haven't seen this, it's worth having a Google at it, but it's a really interesting document which will set challenges across Europe, but also here in the United Kingdom. But again, directly as a result of what happened in 2015 and a little bit before with Nozak and his colleagues. We have something called the Black Goat podcast. Raise your hand if you've looked at the Black Goat, listened to the Black Goat. Some of you have. So I'm pointing in a direction. This is an outstanding podcast, which is led by three very high-profile individuals in this field. We've got Sanjay Siratavaza, we've got Alexa Tullett, and Samin Vazir. This is a podcast which is, in an often light-hearted manner, but also very seriously, is getting us to think differently about science, but not just psychology, all of science. So if you haven't looked at it, I urge you to check it out. We also have now got many new scientific societies. There's a key one here, which is the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science. But what's interesting to me as an observer, and to others in this room, I'm sure, what is also clear is that many existing societies are considering these new ideas. So certainly the groups, certainly international societies that I go to, they all often now have a stream on transparency, on replication, and on new methodology. Again, as a result of the work that has happened over the last number of years. We have a new journal. So the Association of Psychological Science has been incredibly pioneering also in engaging with the so-called replication crisis. So this is the new journal, Advances in Methods and Practice in Psychological Science, edited by Daniel Simons. Again, one would not have imagined such a journal existing pre-2015. The other thing which I think is quite exciting, in a small, exciting way, I might add, is the debate that we're having about statistical significance. So on the left-hand side here, we've got a paper by Daniel Benjamin and many colleagues, some of them in this room today, EJ and others, who are co-authors on this notion that we should be redefining statistical significance. We should move away from p less than 0.05 and adopt an approach of p less than 0.005. But yet then, we have a really healthy and interesting disagreement, which is put forward by Daniel Lakins and colleagues. And I'm putting the right-hand side here, which is justify your alpha, and I suspect some of those co-authors are also in this room today. But the idea this has been healthy, exciting, and I'm sure we will come eventually to a consensus. I'm just putting that up there because it's such a lovely photograph of Daniel. But it's a really excellent article if you try reading it. So what Daniel had endeavored to do was he did it in a crowdsourcing way. He had a live Google Doc where he got lots of people to comment on their thoughts on whether or not we should justify your p-value or not, and to respond to the concerns of the earlier paper by Benjamin and colleagues. But again, the key point of showing this is because it was done collaboratively in an exciting way, which really is getting us to think differently about how we decide on what a signal is for statistical significance. But all is not rosy in the garden of replication and reproducibility. And as alluded to earlier by Susan Fisk, this article was published last week in the Boston Globe. And this is published by a leading geneticist called Pardis Sabeti. And as you can see with the headline, or the sub-editor's headline, is "For Better Science, Call Off the Revolutionaries." Great headline, but it sparked a huge debate. So as a result of this article alone, we are now having a debate about the debate. Here's two key examples of this. So we have Steven Pinker posted shortly after the article was published, "Superstar human geneticist calls for a measured approach to scientific replication. Rigor, of course, but put a lid on the aggression and call off the social media hate mobs." Similarly, Daniel Gilbert, again indicating a similar response. Compensational geneticist has written one of the smartest essays about the politics of social psychology, etc. As you can see, this has been retweeted and liked by many different individuals. But then, of course, in inverted commas, the revolutionaries replied. So Brian Nozak, key player in this area, obviously, then makes the point correctly, I would argue, that he disagrees with some of the characterization in the particular article. If you haven't read the article, it is very much worth reading. And he suggests, as you can see here in his tweet, is that it isn't filled necessarily with lots of hostility, and he said often the movement is positive, respectful, exciting, and forward-looking. Similarly, then we have another response from Amy Cuddy. So Amy, as was mentioned earlier by Susan, has also been involved in a lot of the media storm in terms of replication. She also acknowledges that there's been a really positive move forward. Nonetheless, she also uses the word toxic, or the words toxic bullying. So it's interesting to me, and if you followed this debate on Twitter, what was interesting to me was it was an extraordinary explosion of differences in opinion. And what it made me think of was Brexit, dare I say it. And the idea that there may actually be some sort of echo chamber out there. Because what's interesting to me as a fairly independent observer is the notion that Brian Nozak and many of those excellent colleagues, EJ and others, and Richard and Kate, many people here are very active in talking about the methodological issues that we face as a discipline. They believe entirely in what they're saying. But I also don't doubt for a second that the individuals who have been faced with quite a lot of negative publicity, and particularly on social media, also believe that their view is real. And I can't help but think the fact that many of those individuals in both sides of this debate aren't necessarily seeing the other side's viewpoint. Because, Twitter in particular is a very strong and powerful medium. It was very clear in the US election. It's also very clear in Brexit here that echo chambers and the effects of such can impact on tones of all debates. So again, it's an interesting idea just to think that both sides may be correct, and it'd be nice if we could meet somewhere in the middle. But nonetheless, it's worth acknowledging that very few, I would say it's a relatively small number of real bullying actually happens. But when it happens, it's real and it's very damaging for some individuals. And then the final couple of things I want to say is give you more examples of this blazing, or this trailblazing work that's been going on. Many of you will have seen the excellent paper by Marcus Manafo and colleagues. This is an outstanding piece of work. This manifesto for reproducible science. Again, it's as a result directly of what psychologists have triggered, which will impact on all of science. And as part of this Marcus and his colleagues have identified these many different threats to reproducible science. We're aware of all of these, and I'm not going to reiterate them here. But what's interesting to me is the idea that what we could also try and do is start thinking of science as a behavior. We know there's multiple levels to everything that we're trying to change. So this is a very well-known model of behavior change and a framework for behavior by Susan Mickey and colleagues known as the COM-B system. And what this model identifies that all behavior is as a result of an interaction between these three necessary conditions of capability, opportunity, and motivation. And if you buy into this model, which has been very dominant, we understand a lot about the context in which a behavior happens. So if you further the idea that science is a behavior in the sense that we've got individual aspects of behavior from p-hacking right through to transparency, engaging in pre-registration, and also we've got the whole environment. We've got the incentive structure that exists. And if you look at any of the classic models of behavior change, you need to engage in all levels of the system. And what we should be thinking about, in my view, is we should be thinking about how we can change the incentive structure, and we should also be thinking about what the behaviors are that we're trying to change and promote. And as a result, look to these other models, like persuasion, training, enablement, and we should be moving away as much as possible from any sort of negative characterizations of people who are currently changing their ways and their methods that they're engaging in. So what I've tried to do in the last 20 minutes or so is to hopefully convince you that psychological science really has been a trailblazer over the last 2 years in particular, but as many other colleagues have noted, psychology and science has been changing for a period much longer than that. But we can clearly identify psychology as being central to that change. The revolutionaries, if I'm allowed to use that phrase without EJ or the others giving me a hard time about it, have done an incredible job in a difficult environment. They have improved scientific practice. They've propelled us forward in a way which should only be congratulated. But we have identified that there are some concerns that we should try and offset and change those aspects of the debate. And this is the whole idea of changing the tone when it happens, which is a relatively small tone, but it's a big tone to the individuals who are on the receiving end of it. And also we should remember that science is, and we should see it as a behavior, and we should be targeting both all levels of the system in order to ultimately lead to a long-term and effective change in what we do as psychological scientists. But the final point I would say is it's an incredibly exciting time to be a psychologist. I would love to be an early career psychologist now. You've got this opportunity to learn all these many different methods. There's so many balls that have been thrown in the air, and you can grab some of them and run with it. And it's interesting that many of the excellent work has been done by early career individuals in terms of methodological revolution. So I think we should all embrace it. It's an exciting time, and thank you very much for your attention.